What's going on, everyone? We are back talking about a telephoto zoom lens that has got a number of reviews for its Sony E-mount counterpart out there in the market. You've probably seen a number of YouTube videos already on it, but it's also made for the L-mount Alliance. Like a Panasonic Sigma fans out there, this review is for you. It is the all-new Sigma 100-400 5-6.3 DGDN telephoto zoom lens. Let's talk about it. So before we get into this review, I do want to give a shout out to Sigma Singapore for helping us with this review. However, my thoughts only. We are not paid or sponsored for this in any way, shape, or form. Now, the weapon of choice that the lens is mounted on is the Panasonic S1R. I've got it back. I'm super excited to be using this again. We're going to go more of a long-term review on this camera. I wanted to try with the SL2. I might be able to do that with a friend later on this afternoon. If I do, you will see those images in the Lightroom portion of this review. If not, it's just the Panasonic S1R and a little bit of the Sigma FP. I can tell you, using it with the Sigma FP though, that camera is a little too small for this lens. You want some image stabilization, you want some weight behind the camera body. That's where the S1, the S1R, and the SL2 come into play. With that, let's talk about it. Design-wise, this is a contemporary lens. So this is not the Sigma Art lens, but it still has really good image quality and really good build quality. If you haven't seen the contemporary lenses as of late, they are reminiscent of the Canon and Nikon counterparts, but they really fit well into the L-mount Alliance cameras that are out there in the marketplace. Case in point, it's on the S1R right here, and it looks really good. It almost looks like it's a native lens. It's really up there with the Panasonic build quality. Is it as good as Leica? Hard to say, but also it's a lot less expensive than a Leica lens. The L-mount Alliance, for the most part, is a relatively new partnership between Sigma, Panasonic, and Leica. The Sony counterpart of this is obviously competing with the Sony 100-400, which we reviewed a few weeks ago on the A9 II. But for the L-mount folks out there who maybe want to get into birding or wildlife photography and you want sort of like a longer focal length zoom lens out there, you really don't have much options out there except this, or using an MC21 adapter or a NovaFlex adapter and then adapting your Canon or other lenses that you have that are in that focal range. But if you want native glass or at least a native mount, then this is what you're going to be looking after. Having said that, with the tests and everything else, you'll find out that this lens performs very well in specific use cases. So let's talk about what is inside of this lens. You got 22 elements, 16 groups. The weight of this lens comes in at 1,135 grams. So it's not a very heavy lens for a 100-400 zoom. The filter diameter is 67 millimeters, and you also have OS inside of this lens. You have 2, 1, and off. 2 would be more your sports version. 1 is normal, off is off. Autofocus, manual focus switch on this. Then obviously you can adjust the focal range from full or depending on where you want to go to with that. It's almost like any other zoom lens out there. And then you have a lock switch, so if you don't want to keep this in your bag, you don't want to zoom in and out, you can do so with that. Also, it's a telescopic zoom lens. It grows. It seems to be that a lot of companies nowadays are going back to this type of zoom functionality, even on higher end glass. I don't know why. I mean, personally, as I've said in many other reviews, I prefer internal zooms, but it is what it is. And at the price point, I'm really not going to complain because this comes in far less than the Sony counterpart. And well, there's nothing else like it in the L-mount Alliance. So guys, deal with it. But besides that, let's talk about what it's like to use. All right, let's talk about what this lens is like to use. Now, in terms of autofocus performance, that is really dependent on the L-mount camera. The S1R that I'm using now, it's relatively fast. It's pretty much the same as you would be for a native Panasonic lens. Now for the SL2, I'll find out later if I get a chance to test out that lens. And with the Sigma FP, it's hit and miss depending, of course, on the lighting conditions. The FP is a very particular camera that I think that this lens isn't really designed for. I think it's designed more for the cameras like the S1, the S1R, the SL2 versus a small camera like this, because obviously the image stabilization and all that comes into play, and it really does make it more of a challenge to shoot with. So this is a variable aperture lens. So this is probably going to be one of my criticisms about it, is that it does change the aperture relatively fast. Now, from 100 millimeters, it starts off at 5.0 for the aperture. When you get to 112, it goes to 5.6. And then from 5.6, it goes to 6.3 at 241 millimeters. After that, you're at 6.3 all the way throughout the focal range. From f5 for literally 12 millimeters, that's really not that great. But is it a big difference from 5 to 5.6? depending on your lighting situations. Now, from my experience using this lens, it is best in bright light outdoor activities. If you want to do indoors, if you want to do, let's say, a wedding, a ceremony, or birthday celebration that's indoors with minimal lighting, you're gonna have to really crank up the ISO. Depending on the ISO performance of your camera, it may or may not be usable images. With the S1R, it's pretty decent with low light, so I'm able to rescue some, but for the most part, this is an outdoor lens only. Birding, wildlife, this is where this lens really belongs. But besides that, let's talk about the image stabilization inside of this lens. Now, as I mentioned, there's number 2, number 1 setting, and then off. I found I'm getting more stable shots at number 1 than number 2. Number 2 seems to be dancing around a little bit, but number 1 seems really steady. Usually on other lenses, it's the opposite. Usually 2 is better than 1, but for this lens, it doesn't seem to be the case. At least the copy that I have and the camera that I'm using on it. So your mileage may vary, but I just want to give you a heads up on that. Anyway, when we talk about image quality, we're going to go into Lightroom now and take a look at images shot with the S1R, hopefully the SL2, and the Sigma FP with the 100-400. All right, guys, we are now in Lightroom taking a look at images shot with the Sigma 100-400 f5 to 6.3 with the Panasonic S1R, the Sigma FP, and the Leica SL2. Now, let's talk a little bit about the S1R first, because that's the camera that I use the most throughout this testing. Here is a picture of the Hulk. Now, this is the statue that was in the shop front. This is a very sharp shot. This was shot at ISO 3200, 157 millimeters f 5.6 at 1/200th of a second. I shoot everything in RAW. You can see the detail in the hair and the sculpture here. It is a really sharp shot. But this is what it looked like before the edit. It was the Grinch Who Stole Christmas. I made him into the Hulk again. Again, this is what happens when you shoot inside stores. Sometimes the lighting that they use can throw things amok, but you're able to rescue it with just a quick adjustment in color temperature. Let's move on to another photo here. Let's talk about birding for a moment, because people will shoot birds with this. Now, of course, I wasn't able to go to a proper bird park for this review, so I shot this pigeon, I think it is. It was on top of a building in Arab Street in Singapore, and I got this bird in focus. It was pretty sharp. ISO 100, it was bright daylight. 291 millimeters f6.3 at 1/400th of a second. The bird is tack sharp. This is what it looked like before the edit. What I did is I bringed up the shadows. I just kind of warmed up the image a little bit, bring out the reds in his legs, just to kind of give it some separation. Now let's move on to dogs. Why not? We all like dogs, right? This is a pug that was in a window here. So I'm shooting through glass. So again, it's not going to be the sharpest image. I was focusing on this eye. I pretty much nailed it. This is ISO 800, 100 millimeters f5.0 at 125 or 1/125th of a second. Decent image, plenty sharp. Again, I'm shooting through a window, so it's probably not the best to show you, but this is what it looked like before the edit. This is after the edit. And let's look at portraiture, because portraiture is very important, right? Let's look at this lady here. She was with her fiance or husband-to-be doing a wedding photo shoot on a bridge in Singapore. I was just kind of behind the scenes testing a camera out with a friend of mine. This is a relatively sharp lens for what it is. Now, I did edit this image quite a bit. This is what it looked like before. It's much more of a subtle image coming out of the camera. I boosted up a little bit. Perhaps you might like this edit or not. It could be a little bit aggressive, but again, I wanted to just play around with the image and kind of give a little bit of a urban texture to it. This is ISO 500, 400 millimeters f6.3 at 1/500th of a second. This is a very sharp image of the bottle right there. The Bottega champagne bottle. Before edit, after edit. Again, edits are personal. You might like, you might not like my edits, but just to kind of show you the difference in how you can play with the files. Very sharp, very usable, no issues at all. When you nail focus with this lens, you really get a nice image out of it. Again though, at 400 millimeters, even with the IBIS in the camera and even with the optical stabilization inside the lens, you can get some camera shake at times, so be wary of that. Now let's look at some shots with the Sigma FP. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the review, that the Sigma FP is a little bit of a smaller camera to use with this type of lens. Case in point, here's a picture of a lion I took at the zoo. Now, at first glance, you might think that this is in focus, and this is plenty good enough for social media, but if you go in there, you're gonna see some camera shake happening right here. This happened to be a lot of what I was getting with the Sigma FP, so I didn't shoot with it that much. Even with the image stabilization in the lens, because the camera is so light and it doesn't have any sort of stabilization inside the camera, it's very hard to nail focus at this kind of situation. Also, this line was in shade, so I did have to boost up the ISO a little bit. ISO is at 640, 379.1 millimeters, f6.3 at 1/250th of a second. Now you might say, why didn't you drop down the shutter speed? Again, camera shake came involved. If I upped the shutter speed, it would have been too dark of an image and the ISO would have really taken over and it would really have been a noisy shot.
This one, is it better? Slightly better. Actually, this could be my sharpest shot that I've taken with the Lion. Again, you have to let Lightroom just render, but again, there is some camera shake you see there in the fur, but if you pull out, it looks sharp. Now let's look at the SL2. Okay, here's my friend Peter. We were taking some photos that day, but look at the sharpness out of the SL2. This is very, very impressive. For you Leica users out there, the 100 to 400 you're going to really enjoy. The Leica SL2 produces probably some of the sharpest images I've seen in a full frame camera to date. I mean, the S1R is no slouch, but as you can tell, look at this. The SL2 really does an amazing job. Now, let's look at this cyclist here. I was shooting from a bridge. This is ISO 125, 189 millimeters at 5.6 at 1/400th of a second. I was trying some tracking with the camera to see how it worked. Tracking with the SL2 and the Panasonic S1R are hit and miss, but you know, it can be done. Anyway, going in on this, it's not the sharpest shot here, but again, because the Leica is so sharp, if I pulled out on this and I put this up on social media, you probably wouldn't notice the difference. Very impressed. Now, this is the original shot. This is with the edit. So again, bring up the shadows, change the color temperature a little bit. Yes, the green is off slightly, but I could dial that in if I wanted to, but this is just for a quick edit to show you the differences between this camera and the S1R and the Sigma FP.
So my overall thoughts about this lens, it's a very sharp, well-performing lens, especially at this price point. I mean, the bokeh is very nice on it. The images coming out of it are really good with optimal lighting conditions. I mean, I really can't complain about the quality that's coming out of this lens at all. It would have been nice to see if Sigma come out with an art version of this, but then again, that might be a lot more expensive and considerably more heavier as well. And so I think the contemporary version really does this mount and this lens design justice. Now, in terms of how it fits into the L-mount Alliance, as I mentioned before, there's really nothing else out there that competes with this currently. The only other option that you could say that if you wanted to use is the Panasonic 70-200 f2.8, throw a teleconverter on it to sort of get to that focal range, and then you would technically be at a 5.6 when you do convert the aperture from 2.8 to 2 times it. That might be an option if you already have that lens, maybe invest in the teleconverter and save some money. However, if you don't have that and you really want to just have one lens that is a 100 to 400, this is the option you have. I mean, yes, you can adapt your Canon lenses if you want to use adapters, but it's not the same as using a native L lens with an L mount. Sigma is, for the most part, the only other company out there that's going to make lenses like this for the L-mount Alliance. Leica's already told me they're not making anything above the 90 to 280 out there because it would be too expensive and it would just be too heavy to carry around, and they probably wouldn't sell that many, so they said rely on Sigma, and so Sigma has come to the table with these kind of lenses, and I'm looking forward to a 600 or 500 from them very soon, hopefully. I have no information, but hopefully that's the case. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the 100 to 400. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Like always, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube. Be safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.